This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Potters, are you looking for high-quality equipment and supplies? Since 1974, Bailey Pottery Equipment, based in Kingston, New York, has produced equipment used in schools, universities, and art centers nationwide. Their gas kilns, renowned for ease of use, fuel efficiency, and beautiful results, are a global favorite. Bailey Pottery Equipment caters to all skill levels, offering a range of equipment and top brand ceramic supplies at discounted prices, all backed by their outstanding personal service. Visit BaileyPottery.com, the professional's choice for all things clay.
Hey folks, Sunshine Cobb here, ceramic artist and current resident coordinator at the Bray. I'm excited to announce that our application portal is now open for our 2025 residency cohort. Applications are due by December 19th, 2024. For details on all our residencies available, head to archibray.org/residencies. Please help us spread the word about this amazing new opportunity at the Bray. Thanks so much.
Hello, my name is Kathy King, and welcome to the For Flux Sake podcast. I'm coming to you from the Harvard Ceramics program in our fair city, Allston, Massachusetts. I'm here with Rose and Matt Katz of the world-famous Ceramic Materials Workshop, and they are ready to answer your burning questions about clay and glaze. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Fluxed Up. Hey, Matt and Rose.
Hey,
Kathy.
We are all so excited to greet our guest. Osa Atoe is with us today. Isn't that incredible? Hello, Osa.
Hey, you guys.
Hi, Osa.
Hi.
Hey.
Well, thank you so much. As we said before we started recording, we had a bumpy morning in terms of getting everybody together here. You know, Mercury's in retrograde. I don't know what's going on, but I am so excited to see you. I'm such a fan of Osa's. She was with us here at Harvard Ceramics last year and gave this incredible workshop with David McDonald. And I'm personally a big follower of your work with different wild clays and terra sigs. Oh my goodness, you just light up the screen with those.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely beautiful work.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the wild clay is coming in right on time because what I'm going to talk about is how I have to retire a glaze combo that has become so deeply problematic. This is a perfect RIP.
Therapy.
Yeah.
We're here for you.
I just had to give it up.
This is a safe space. It's okay to cry. It's all right. We've all lost a glaze.
I mean, the wild clay is what's giving me comfort in this moment when I have to give up one of my prized surfaces.
Oh, okay. To start from the beginning, Osa.
All right. Well, so maybe like 2017, 2018, I want to say like 6-7 years ago, I found a glaze recipe online that I really liked. Some community craft guilds in Pennsylvania maybe published it on their website. And it's a variegated copper glaze that actually, so I work at with cone 5, cone 6, mid-range red stonework glaze. Okay, so a lot of glazes just don't show up well on that clay body. And this one's no different. It turns into some weird muddy green color if you just put it straight on the clay body that I use. So there was this one day where I was like working a craft market, and one of my fellow potter friends was just like, just like dip different glazes together, and this is when, I mean, I still don't know a ton about glaze chemistry, but I knew even less like 6 or 7 years ago. So my main way of experimenting with glazes was just kind of mixing and seeing what happened. And so I had this off-white matte glaze that I dipped a tile into, and then I dipped this other variegated copper glaze on top of it, right? And I tried it all these different ways. That was the combination that gave me something that I liked. It breaks over texture. I mean, there's phase separation. There's like, glassy greens. There's like metallic silvers in there. There's just all this interesting stuff that happens. When I first started experimenting with it, I just assumed that dipping both would not work on a pot because it would just be too much glaze, and I assumed it would crawl or, you know, melt off the pot or something like that. And so I began by spraying the combination. And then I think by accident, I discovered that you could actually dip and dip, and it came out beautifully. It gave me this like really thick, juicy coverage on the outside. And like all of those qualities that I'm explaining and describing came out even more when I dipped both coats, right? So I've been doing this for years, and there's always been some unpredictability and loss with this process, but almost like atmospheric firing, I was like, well, in order to get these cool results, sometimes you just have to, just put up with a little bit of nonsense and a little bit of a loss. So that's how I've been operating with that glaze. I mean, when I got beautiful results, I really loved it, but there were times where, there was a big learning curve. Like I had a situation where a couple times where all of the glaze ran off the pots and stuck to the kiln shelves.
No.
That whole thing where you're just like, I'm not even going to bother grinding this. I'm just throwing the whole thing away. Like, this is insane, right? So that happened to me a couple of times during the last 6 years, but mostly I could get my results, right? Recently, I'm really not sure what happened. I'm suspecting some shift in my ingredients because now I'm getting the flaws that I thought I was going to get initially 6 or 7 years ago, which is like bald spots on my pots,
Crawling, yeah.
crawling, just things that never happened before. It's always been finicky in terms of thickness. It's the one glaze that I always have to measure specific gravity for, not for the bottom layer, but for the top layer. That's what matters the most. I've always had to measure specific gravity, but there's a trick with that too, where I would thin out the glaze to the specific gravity that I thought I needed. But now I know that glazes sometimes take a while to bloom into the water. So the times that I got that disaster where they all melted, it was because I thought I got it to the right specific gravity. I would measure it, but then I would go back and check the bucket and be like, what happened? And the specific gravity would be much higher, right? Because it had time.
Yeah, happens to us all the time. I mean, and you can imagine in a community studio when people are like maybe altering, leaving lids up. I mean, it's so hard to keep up.
Yeah.
So therapeutic for me, you guys, because my husband doesn't want to hear about all these problems.
But you married up. You married a non-ceramicist. So
Caring about these details, right? Like nobody cares. It's so boring.
Okay, I have questions.
All right.
Okay. Couple of variables. Now, is this all on the wild clay, or was it behaving differently on different clay bodies?
No, none of this is wild clay times. This is before all of this. So I'm using a commercial clay body. Back then I was using Louisiana, what was it called? Alligator Clay Company out of Baton Rouge, a clay body called Red Star. Very bright red. In fact, I realized that a lot of my glazes were not actually agreeing with that clay body. And I only realized that when I moved to Florida and switched to high water red stone, which is a lighter red. And I think that the intensity, maybe the amount of red iron oxide or something in my first clay body was causing problems for me that I didn't even realize until I switched.
But you've been consistently using the redstone since then.
Yes.
And what's your Bisque temperature?
04.
And you said you thought there might be some material changes. Were there any weird materials in there? Guernsey borate, Custer, which we just lost, anything
Honestly,
like that?
Let me look at the hang on.
I'm looking up redstone, which at cone 6 is less than 1% absorption. It looks like a higher firing terracotta that's like fired to its max.
Mm-hmm.
But I go to cone 5, so, or with a hold. So probably a little bit more than 1% absorption for me.
Oh, that's a pretty high-fired red clay. That's pretty robust terracotta.
Yeah, I mean, I think the more I learn about the term terracotta, the less I understand it. I always thought terracotta referred to a low fire clay body, and these are developed to be mid-range clays. And not every distributor even has a mid-range red.
That's such a good point, because we were in an episode we recorded, we were talking about earthenware and terracotta and that lingo. And you're right. Like in a mod, if you're just starting ceramics now, it must be really confusing to understand,
Everything's confusing about ceramics when you're
Well,
first starting out.
True. Yeah.
I
True.
mean, I think people often assume that terracotta means a red clay, but there's white terracotta. There's white earth.
And that's the whole thing of all these terms are made up. That they are subjective as to how people refer to them. Like terracotta technically, it means baked earth, and it is referring to a low fire. But the real thing to understand is all clay bodies have a firing range. There's what the clay company sells them as, but like you can fire a lot of low temperature bodies a lot hotter than they are diagnosed or what they're sold as. And it's just a question of what it's going to do at temperature X. Because most low fire bodies are under matured, and that's what they're sold as. Like you make it for sculpture, you make it for, a tradition that's a low fire, that's fine. But could it go higher? Yeah. What Rose is really saying is one of the big tricks is you can fire a lot of terracottas or red clays up to cone 4 and you won't see any problems. But all the classic problems that people see when they're suffering with dark clay bodies comes from firing over cone 4, because what happens is iron begins to decompose and it releases oxygen, and that creates bloating and blistering and bubbling, and it can come through the glaze, or the body can swell, or all these types of things. So the color change, that's just what happens, because as you make more glass, those red things look brown, and that's just the natural. But it's really of how far you can push it. And cone 5, you'll often see a lot of red bodies are sold as cone 5, not cone 6. Just cone 5, because the farther you get away from cone 4, like the more treacherous the lifespan of that clay is going to be.
Yeah, and I see Osa's wheels turning, that she probably had some issues you just brought up that she didn't realize she had.
Well, actually, what I was thinking about was this clay body called Earthen Red that Highwater offers. They advertise the range as cone 04 to cone 6, and it definitely bloats at cone 6. I don't use that clay body though, so my range is 4 to 6 on the redstone. Say it's 4 to 6. Anyway, do you want to hear the recipe?
Or at least the ingredients. You don't need to tell us all the rest.
Yeah, you don't have to tell us percentages. You could tell us just what's in it.
Okay, so NEFSI, EPK, silica, Gersley borate, whiting, lithium, titanium dioxide, and then copper for the colorant.
And that's lithium carbonate.
Yeah, it does have a little 6%, about 6%. And what I've learned, I think, about this, so I've been trying to find other substitutes or other recipes for a reactive mid-range glaze. And the most popular one I could find is Jen's Juicy Fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that this is a variation of that, because I looked at the recipes side by side and they're quite similar.
That's a pretty consistent thing, that like talking about names in clay bodies not meaning much. Names in glazes don't mean a ton, because there are so many glazes that are all basically the same thing. But it's like, yeah, this is Bob's shiny white. This is Christine's flat white. And like, all right, they're all the same thing when you get down to the chemistry. With that recipe, what's your Gersley borate situation these days? Do you still have real Gersley borate? Did you switch over to a substitute?
No, I'm still using the real stuff as far as I know. Recently I was given a EPK substitute, diamond kaolin, but I haven't used that recipe yet. So you're thinking that Gersley borate is the biggest suspect here?
Gersley borate's always a huge suspect.
Yeah, you got some other things in there too that are suspect.
But it's like when Rose and I are wondering, when we were just talking the other day, we're married, so we've got kids, and when something goes wrong, which kid you're looking at first. Gersley borate's tricky, because Gersley borate is a really unrefined material. because it's actually composed of 3 different minerals that all occur in the same deposit. And the mixing together of those minerals after they were mined can be really chaotic. And it can have some other problems. Like one of those minerals is a bentonite, which is why glazes with Guernsey borate will tend to get really thick all of a sudden, and get jelly and things like that. So it tends to be more problematic. And I ask that specifically now because they've officially stopped selling real Guernsey borate. That is gone. And so a lot of people have switched to the substitutes, and there have been some major issues coming up with some of the substitutes recently. So that's always just something we look to. But if you're still using original Guernsey borate, that's not it. And the rest of the materials, there's not a huge amount of changes to any of those.
Well, it's possible that I could have gotten a substitute and not known. They don't always tell you, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the tricky part sometimes.
Like right now, I can't get any one to come out right. Like I've always had some failure, but now it's like so consistently bad that I just had to leave it all behind.
Oh.
Well, you did mention a couple of things which are a really big deal just to think about, with that glaze in the past, but as you go forward, you said one of the things that for me is I really try to emphasize people when they're just learning about applying glazes and layering as a process, because oftentimes people are like, oh yeah, all of a sudden I layered these 2 glazes and they ran like crazy. And the thinking is oftentimes like, oh, there's some weird chemical reaction. The answer is like, no, it just went on really thick. Oftentimes you really have a distorted perspective on how thick a glaze application really is. This is one of our human failures, that we look at a glaze application, we're like, yeah, that looks about right. But like those glazes are functioning on the particulate scale, on the molecular scale. And so the thickness of that application is actually could be quite different because you hung out in the glaze for an extra half second. And so you got X much more glaze on there. And so you tend to get it really thick because glazes really only run for 2 reasons. They're too thick or they're overfired, or 3, they're too thick and overfired. And so like working those applications is really hard. And you said it, like watching the specific gravity. What we prefer rather than watching specific gravity is start by weighing your water. Okay. So when you have your recipe, have your water as an ingredient. And when you're working with a glaze, what we always recommend is start with a low amount of water, weigh it out, mix up the batch, let it sit for 3 days. You called that, you got that. And then check how it flows, adjust the water after 3 days to where you like it, and then check the specific gravity. And that weight in specific gravity should be your goal in the long term so that your application will be more consistent.
I mean, I've just learned the more time you can give yourself to do every little step of the process, the better. I mean, when I was beginning, I would definitely make glaze the same day and try to use it, right? I never do that now. I never do that now. We went to visit this potter named Charles Smith in Mobile, Alabama, and he's just like, I'll line the inside of a pot and leave it till the next day and then do the outside. He's just like not in a rush.
That is excellent advice. From him. That is such good advice, because that was the next thing I wanted to talk about is absorption from the Bisqueware. Oh my gosh, one of the biggest things possible is, the reason glaze application dries so quick is because the Bisqueware absorbs the water. We've got capillary suction. But just like your sponge can only absorb so much water, your Bisqueware can only absorb so much water. So say if you glaze the inside and immediately turn around and glaze the outside, that outside application is going to have a different application rate because the suction has gone down because you saturated it when you did the inside. And is it insanely pragmatic, wait overnight or put it in front of a fan? Yeah, but it'll cause a lot less heartache with doing that. That's amazing. But the one thing too that I wanted to say is, here's the controversial one. Here's where we'll get emails. Is
we get them anyway. It doesn't matter.
I would recommend bisquing lower.
Yeah, I was thinking too.
An 04 bisque is a lie. 04 bisque causes a lot more problems.
I mean, go to Bisque higher because that prevents other problems. I'm just like, which one is it?
That's what I was taught. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Although I will say, we literally have an email in our inbox for the show, and it was somebody saying, and I hear it all the time, of you said Bisque lower, and I Bisque lower, and all of a sudden I had, my problems went away. Here's the thing. So conventional wisdom with bisquing higher is like, oh, it'll be a cleaner bisque or something like that. Yeah, it's not really the case. Even on a red body, anything that's burning out of that body is burning out at fairly low temperatures, well before cone 012. So as long as you get to cone 012, that bisqueware is as clean as it's ever going to be. And we can track this. We can track with a metric called like LOI, loss on ignition. You weigh it before you fire it, you weigh it after you fire it, you see how much weight it loses. And clays don't lose any more weight after cone 012. All that stuff has come out. And it doesn't matter, red bodies, porcelains, whatever. The problem with a cone 04 bisque is if cleanliness doesn't make a difference, what does it do? Well, the catch is the hotter you bisque, the more you're going to reduce the absorption rate of that clay body. Okay, so it's going to go down. That is not inherently bad if you're used to applying like that with whatever it is. But the catch is because you're on the descent in absorption, it is now going to be dependent on exactly what temperature that 04 really is. And that's a big deal, because is that kiln a little bit hot? Is it a little bit cold? Is it a little bit hot or cold from top to bottom? Because at 04, kilns are really inconsistent. They're pretty consistent when you get to cone 6 and cone 10, but at low temperatures, they can be really hot and cold. And what that means is you'll get different absorption rates, even in the same bisque kiln. Whereas if you back it down to cone 08 is like, that's our safe zone, where like pretty much all clay bodies are going to be the same absorption rate at cone 08. And we've tracked this. We've got dozens and dozens of profiles of commercial clay bodies on our website that people can check out, but all clay bodies are fine by cone 08. The catch, the difference, and the thing that people need to be aware about bisquing to cone 08 is that your absorption rates will be higher. Okay, so the glaze is going to want to take up, or the clay body is going to want to take up more water. So you may have to increase your water content a little bit. Again, that goes to weighing your water, or, maybe decrease your dip time so that the coatings aren't as thick. But the clay body itself is going to behave more consistently and give you the same application. So you don't have that one firing where all the pots suddenly run. That to me sounds like a classic, like, oh, maybe that firing was a little cold, the absorption rate was high, you didn't know, you didn't adjust for it, and then you get stuck with a lot of running pots.
I mean, I know that in that runny pot situation, my specific gravity was much too high.
Yeah, and that'll do it too. That's the same thing.
And it was because I was adjusting in the moment instead of letting it sit at least overnight. So I know that that's what happened with that. But I mean, I'm at a point now where I can't get any good results. I know, I mean, I would have batches that were a little on the thin side or a little on the thick side. The occasional run off the pot would happen maybe like twice in the last 6 or 7 years. Now I'm like, nothing's coming out good. And I'm getting all kinds of flaws that I was never getting before. So something besides my application and process has shifted. I've always, it's always been a high maintenance glaze combo. It's always been finicky, but now it's impossible. So.
Oh, I hate those glazes. You love them so much, and then you just have to let them go sometimes.
So have you embarked on the journey to find the replacements, and are you like in testing mode right now, or like how are you approaching this?
I gave up.
Oh, baby. Oh.
Seriously, like, I mean, well, I tried a lot of different things. Since I'm working with Sidge so much, I was like, let's just take the first layer of glaze out and just try like an OM4 Sidge,
Yeah.
And then what that did was the character of the glaze changed a lot. Obviously, I lost a lot of the character that I enjoyed. It's still giving me breaking and variegation, but it was giving me the exact flaws that people who use Jen's Juicy Fruit complain about, which made me kind of make that connection. And I started comparing, because if you go on glazy.org and you go to Jen's Juicy Fruit, you can read, the comments of like what people are dealing with, troubles that people are dealing with. So I was getting like the weird pinholing, but also the surface was just a lot drier and less juicy. I don't know. I tried a lot of different things. And I just got to the point where I was like, this is a waste of time and materials. And also like how many ceramicists who are working like I do have like 3, 4, 5 different surfaces. I still have, I've got this new wild clay thing. I'm really excited about that. Thank goodness. I still have my off-white breaking glaze that I alternate with other glazes. It's all my decorating and blah, blah, blah. So it's not like I don't have really cool options going on. I started to feel kind of greedy. Like I want to have all these different cool surfaces,
Yeah, but so but so much about your work is the beauty of the design, the surface design, the texture, how you treat that, how you separate the form, through bands or different areas of well, I repeat myself in texture, but that's why I think the terra sigillata route has been so exciting, and I love that about your work. And I'd love, while we have you, could you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems like your practice is, as you travel, you always get an eyeball out looking for, a different clay body that you might be able to try. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I mean, it started off really casually. When I lived in Louisiana, we used to go to some like the woods, and me and my husband can't remember which one of us found it. I think it was him. He thinks it was me, but we found some really pretty clay in a creek, and I would just mess with it at the creek. I would go home and like test a little lump of it just to see what it did. But this was years ago. And I never really thought about uniting it with my practice. I was like, well, I can't, it wasn't a place that I would ever dig. It's a public park. It's a really beautiful area. Like it's not like a national forest or BLM land or anything like that. So yeah, it started kind of casually with just noticing clay in the landscape and like collecting tiny samples of it and testing it at home and seeing what it did. And not testing Sidge, just testing a little pinch pot or something just to see. And then what happened? I don't know how it dawned on me. I started just trying to make Sidge. The first 2 times I made Sidge here in Florida with the wild clay, it didn't actually work very well. I tried a clay that had too much organic material in it, and it just kind of peeled off the tile when it dried. There was no adhesion. One of them came out really dull, so I just kind of kept trying, and it evolved naturally. I was doing clay cohorts with Lisa Orr, and Pete Pinnell came virtually and did a workshop on terra sigillata specifically. And it was around that same time that I was just collecting and testing. And I went to Alabama Clay Conference and met a guy named Zach Sierski, and who's from not Mobile.
Digs a lot.
He digs a ton, and he actually is one of those like Cone 10 guys who processes his own clay bodies and wood fires, and he gave me a sample of this really pretty pink clay, and it was just so different from any of the clays that I can find here in Florida. All our clays here are very, very sandy. This was very like pure plastic clay, so it made a really beautiful Sidge right away. And then that spurred me to just make all the samples, like try all the samples that I had already collected, because I had this weird backstock and like plastic bags and stuff that I wasn't really sure what to do with. And and everyone always tells you, oh, if you're going to dig wild clay, you should get a lot, because by the time that you're done testing, So everyone makes you feel like you just need to have buckets and buckets.
Coming out of the woods with a bucket.
And people do, right? Like you see people with their like, the 5-gallon buckets and all this, but all they have are like grocery bags, right? So I never quite knew what to do with them, but the grocery bag quantity is perfect for Sidge. I can make several batches of Sidge with a grocery bag full of clay. I mean, and that depends, obviously. Like every clay has a different yield when it comes to Sidge. So there's some clays that'll give you like this much Sidge, and some clays, like basically the whole clay is Sidge, the entire chunk. So, but I did want to jump right back to the clay that the glaze combo that I'm giving up. Part of the reason that it's painful isn't just because of the technical problems. This is a combination that I came up with when I lived in Louisiana, where there aren't that many places to swim and there isn't a lot of blue water. I moved to Florida. This glaze was like vibing with the environment.
The Florida glaze.
It's like matching the color of the ocean. The fluidity of the glaze is like mirroring the fluidity in our landscape. So like that's the hard thing to give up, is that watery feel. I don't really have anything else that's fluid in that way, that shows fluidity. And so working with the wild clay siges is predictable, but time consuming, because I'm like painting, painting, and painting. Working with the combination that I was talking about is less time consuming because I'm letting the glaze do most of the heavy lifting. I carve less, I decorate less, but the glaze is doing most of the heavy lifting, but there was a ton more loss with that I was willing to accept up until it just got out of hand.
Boy, that is a great thing to note, though, for makers, of understanding that discrepancy between the effort and the return and the loss and the stress. Because I mean, you're saying you're sort of paring down what you have, because that's what most professionals do. Of like, they've got like 3 glazes. Boom. These are the 3 glazes. I know them. I've used them for many, many years. And that's it. And then it comes down to how to accent it, how to express it, how to use your form and your clay to get to that level of communication. And when you lose, one of your limbs, one of your tools, it's heartbreaking.
It's sad. That's I said the only thing keeping me going right now is these wild clays. Like at least there's something,
Well, I have a feeling like I'm not sure we've helped you, but you are going to get so many glazes sent to you after this airs. Well, yeah, maybe, if they can show the evidence, they can prove it works. I'd say that's going to be a gift.
So did you find any clay in Harvard when you were there?
She didn't have time to go.
No, I'll tell you what, though. I went to Massachusetts twice that year. You know what I'm talking about, Kathy? And I was hanging out with this woman named Susan Bernstein, who lives in Cambridge. And she took us out to Cape Cod. And there is some amazing clay out there that runs off of a small cliff. And so there's a freshwater spring, a tiny freshwater spring. It flows down onto the beach and it carries all of this gray clay down.
Oh, cool.
You fire it and it's self-glazing because of all of the salt in the atmosphere.
Oh,
I made a couple cups out of it without processing it at all. So it's kind of, like very sandy, froggy, but it's self-glazed.
Oh, cool.
So I haven't made that into a sig yet, but I'm really curious about what that. But yeah, I mean, that's what I mean. I was just like going around and finding all this stuff. And so now I have this like backlog of all these samples. So yeah, I'll let you know what that one turns out to be. But no, I mean, in the city, it's hard, right? You have to be out in the woods somewhere.
Well, it's interesting. When we have Harvard students over and we give them an intro to clay type thing, I always use this clay that came from a construction site in Boston called the Big Dig years ago. It was had a lot of scandal around it. But anyway, so the clay, when dry, is like this olive green color. And then I show, how this rock like material disintegrates in water, and then I show them the fired result, which looks just like a terracotta, and it's kind of cool to have that as a way to discuss those changes. Like, I mean, I'm sure you've been surprised by some of the clays that you've picked up of what you actually got afterwards.
No, absolutely. So the place that you're describing, was it a pottery workshop or was it a brickyard or?
Oh, the big dig. It was yeah, it's the tunnel that takes all the traffic in Boston underground instead of above on street level.
They literally excavated the center of Boston over decades
underneath the city and like dug out. Oh my God. I couldn't even fathom how much dirt. And
yeah. And it was at a layer that like they were finding like colonial artifacts, so it was because I thought like, oh, is it, pollution or asphalt, or the, more modern things getting mixed up. And I think it's just a good old fashioned sitting in one place and get moldy. I don't know.
Well, the terra sigs is such a great way to use wild clay, because one of the heartbreakers is some wild clays are not great for working in a clay body, but the sigs can give you all of that personality of the green and the reds and the browns and the whites and all of that color coming out. And sigs, I personally think that sigs are one of the most underloved technical applications in glaze, because everybody's like, I want the underglaze because it's got the color, and I want the glaze because it's got the movement. But the sigs, that was always my soft spot back when I was a student. I was making tons of sigs, and I absolutely loved it. And having that diversity is amazing. Because it's a level of play versus the glazes. Like you mentioned Jen's juicy fruit. Man, I gotta tell you, in our classes, I actually mentioned Jen's juicy fruit as an example of the ultimate chaos that a glaze can have from a technical perform. Yeah, it literally has everything that will make your life crazy. And there's this contrast of like, I'm not saying like don't use it, but there's definitely that contrast in making of, glazes that are chaotic are exciting, but they are heartbreaking because of that level of chaos. And for me, it's always like, you could date that wild person that you meet at the party and they're crazy and fun. And then there's the guy studying accounting and management who's not boring, but is nice and stable. And like, it's always that contrast between the two of them. But the wild and crazy can break your heart, because man, juicy fruit has got, it's got like 10% soda ash and 10% lithium carb and Gerstley borate and titanium dioxide. These are literally the elements of chaos and glaze chemistry. So yeah, like if you do work with it, you have to do like what we were talking about. You have to spend the time of get to know that glaze in ways that are just beyond the test style. Literally, that's one of those things we always hear. Literally, somebody just posted on our social media this morning. They gave us that. Well, it's really easy to get a glaze in a test tile, but it's different on the pot. And it's like, yeah, of course it is. But and honestly, not to throw shade, but it's the people that are making the pots that are not putting in enough effort to work with that glaze on the pot, that they just assume like, oh, it should just slap it on. And like, all of us, at least a lot of us came out of commercial glaze as our first glaze. And those are designed to like slap it on and it's easy and it works. And a test tile, like, yeah, you can dip it and it works. But when you get to a pot, you got to talk about what's the body, what's the absorption rate, what's the Bisque temperature, what's the water content, what's the specific gravity, what's the viscosity, how long am I applying it for? Am I dipping? What brush am I using for my brush?
The size of the glazing a mug and glazing a pitcher is going to be different.
Yeah.
And spending that
it's
time,
endless.
doing the reps, it's just what it takes to get that working relationship. So as you look for the new one, yeah, just spend the time, do it as, that's your ceramic side hustle on your own time. Throw it on a couple pots, see what it does, but pay attention to all those variables, the water content, the Bisque temperature, all that big deal.
I'm going to take up watercoloring.
Any art form where you don't have to feed it to the fire later.
Right?
Oh
that's crazy.
This to ourselves.
Oh my goodness. Osa, thank you so much. If anyone deserves good clay karma, it is this woman right here. So thank you so much for sharing this with us and just being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. This is really fun and really cathartic.
Oh, good. It was so nice to meet you.
You too.
Well, folks, that's it for this week's episode of For Flux Sake. I'd like to thank the listeners who submitted questions this week. And if you want your question answered on the show, shoot us an email at ForFluxSakePodcast@gmail.com. So join us next time. And when in your studio, remember what Rose always says.
Always remember to test, test, test. This is a test of the emergency glaze system.